Hello everybody and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. In today's video we are going to see a topic that I think is super important in order to become an advanced Ruby on Rails developer, and that is background jobs. And more precisely, we are going to see three things about background jobs. First of all, we will see what are background jobs, then we will see when you should use background jobs, and then at last I will give you some best practices in order to write good background jobs. So stay with me and let's get started. Okay, so as you can imagine, not everything in Ruby on Rails is handling web requests. That will be the user-facing synchronous part of the framework, which is the typical use flow in which a user sends a request and then is waiting in front of the computer until the request comes back. So what are actually background jobs? As its name suggests, background jobs are pieces of code that are meant to be run asynchronously as background processes. Okay, now that you know what are background jobs, when should you use them? In my experience, there are three main scenarios in which you should be using background jobs. The first of all is clear, scheduled tasks. The second one is a little bit more advanced, and it is when you have time-consuming tasks within requests flows. And the third one is also more advanced even, and it is when you need to do requests to third-party systems within your use cases. Okay, let's see each group in detail, and let's start with the first one, which is scheduled tasks. Scheduled tasks are more or less what you will already know as cron jobs, that is, tasks that are meant to be executed periodically. Examples of these tasks are, for example, cleanup tasks, mailing, report generation, billing processing, updating search engines, and also tasks that deal with big amounts of data, among many others. This would be the most common scenario, and you may have already worked with this if you work already in a decent size code base. Examples of this implementation would be the Whenever and also the Sidekick scheduler gem, which we could see in an upcoming video if you want. The next scenario will be time-consuming tasks that happen within your request flows. That will be a little bit more advanced or polished, I would say. And it's, for example, if you have a user that sends a request to your application and that request implies completing a task that is going to take a long time to complete, you should execute that task in a background job. For example, imagine that you have a user that has to generate a report, or your application offers that use case, report generation. So what I would recommend for a good user experience is that your user should be just creating the report and your application should return immediately with a message indicating the user that the report is being generated and that the user will be notified when the report is ready. Okay, and the last scenario, and probably the one that most people will not know, is when you have to deal with third-party systems. And because this implies working with distributed systems, and not all code bases have to deal with this. Let's say, for example, that your application has a use case that implies sending a request to a third-party system. What happens in this case is that you don't know, first of all, how long it's going to take for the third-party system to come back with a response, and most importantly, you even can't ensure if that third-party system is going to be available. So probably you wouldn't receive any answer. In this case, I think it's better to return a response immediately to the user when saying, for example, that the request has been accepted, and then letting the background job backend process the request for the third-party system. A good example of this will be an API that needs to communicate with an IoT device. Imagine, for example, that within your use case, the API at some point needs to send some command to an IoT device. And it will happen, and it happens a lot with IoT devices, that they are not available, or that for some reason there is a problem on the network and it takes a lot for it to get the request processed. So in these cases, what I recommend is that the user sends the request to your API, and then your API immediately returns to the user telling that the request has been accepted, and in the background it sends the request to the IoT device. And then you will also offer a polling mechanism so that the user can poll your API to know the status of the IoT device to see if the operation has been successful. Okay, now that you know when you should use background jobs, let me give you 2 recommendations that you should take into account when writing code for your background jobs. The first recommendation I think it's good taking into account is idempotency. And that means that you should write your background jobs thinking on executing them several times without side effects. That means, for example, that if you want to rerun a background job, you should be able to execute it without causing any issues in your system. And that is because of the following reasons. It could happen that a background job has failed and you want to retry them. Many of the background backends offer this possibility out of the box. It could also happen that you don't know if a background job has been executed and you want to execute it. You don't know if it has been the first time or the second time, or if it has run multiple times, but you want to be sure that no matter how many times you execute that job, it's not going to cause any harm to your application as a whole. And it could also happen that, for example, you had a background job that executes or updates several records in your Rails application, and it would happen that it had failed at some point in the middle of the execution. So you should be able to retry again that background jobs no matter how many records had already been updated. You should be able to retry it from scratch without again causing any harm to your application as a whole. The last best practice I want to recommend you is that you should take advantage of the queue system in your background jobs backends. And that is, for example, that you could create a, let's say, low priority queue and a high priority queue, and then you could assign more resources to the high priority queue so that all the jobs that are queued in the high priority queue get executed before the jobs that are queued in the low priority queue. And then when you're writing the code for your background jobs, you could decide to execute the jobs that are critical to your application in the high priority queue, and the jobs that are not that critical to your application and you don't mind that they are executed a little bit later in the low priority queue. And that's it for today. In my next video we could talk about the different background jobs backend options that are in Ruby on Rails today, or we could talk about using the Whenever or Sidekick scheduler gems. Tell me in the comment section down below what you prefer. So if you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to smash the like button so that you help me with the YouTube algorithm. And without further ado, I hope to see you in my next video. Adios!